So welcome to everyone. I am Professor Jax Kirtley of the Entrepreneurship Group here at the Wharton School. And this webinar is a preview of the first edition of the Corporate Venturing Report put together by the Mack Institute of Innovation Management at the Wharton School. This year, Mack Institute celebrates 25 years since its birth as a center for advancing Wharton faculty research in innovation and entrepreneurship and driving real-world impact through industry collaboration and hands-on learning experiences. I'm talking today with two of the report's co-authors. Serguei Netessine is the Senior Vice Dean of Innovation of Global Initiatives and the Dhirubhai Ambani Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Wharton School. His research focuses on business model innovation and operational excellence with applications across retail, technology, and aerospace industries. Claudio Garcia Costa Carvalho is a senior industry fellow at the Mack Institute. Throughout his career, Claudio held general management and strategy roles across various industries, including food and beverage, finance, entertainment, media, and professional services. He also both of our speakers sit on advisory boards of several organizations and startups. So first I want to say, please, attendees, throughout our time here, please put questions into the chat. We're going to have a period of Q&A at the end. But what I want to do is to start off and have Serguei, if you could give us some introduction or a summary of the report to get us started. And I know you have slides.
Thank you, Jax. Yes, I do. So let me share my slides. So I prepared a few slides for everyone as a quick introduction into our study. Again, I'm Serguei Netessine. I'm a senior vice dean and professor at the Wharton School, and we named our study very, very appropriately When Goliath Needs David, how corporations and startups are redefining corporate venturing. I hope it will be clear through results of our reports why we named it that way. We believe that there has been a very interesting evolution of this space of collaboration between large companies and startups. Of course, the examples that everyone knows probably about is Microsoft and OpenAI, where early on Microsoft and OpenAI initiated collaboration. And eventually this became a bigger and bigger collaboration, a multi-billion-dollar investment on Microsoft's part. And now OpenAI is part of many, many services that Microsoft offers. So this became kind of an essential part of Microsoft's ecosystem. So this is, of course, one of the bigger examples. There are many, many, many smaller examples. And what we did in this research, we systematically went through all the available information for 500 biggest global companies in the world, scanned their financial reports, websites, anything that they say publicly. So I guess a caveat for our report is that we summarized what companies tell us they do with startups. But there is very often no way to verify if that's actually what they end up doing between a big company and a startup company. So with that caveat, we assembled lots of information, and I just want to bring you immediately to some of our key findings. The report is rather long, but one thing that we found is that there is really no one-size-fits-all mode of collaboration between startups and big companies. We identified many modes of collaboration, and some companies just have one, and other companies have every single mode of collaboration that we discovered. And it really all is a function of what are you trying to achieve in this collaboration. We observed a rise of a couple of at least interesting practices. The venture clienting stands out, where a big company becomes a client for a startup's service. And this is something that we did not really see like 10, 20 years ago. We believe it's a relatively new practice. So that has been a bit of a discovery for us. we saw that a collaboration between startups and big companies becomes kind of an emerging tool for business. We see some standard problems that big companies are trying to solve, like gaining technological edge or reducing their risk in development of new technology. But there are some interesting other goals that organizations pursue. For example, increasing diversity, increasing equity, developing their ESG agenda, for example. And that again is something that we did not see, say, a decade ago. And finally, we see increasingly that big companies are trying to create an ecosystem around themselves, and startups become a part of this ecosystem. And this ecosystem can be meant to sell products and services of the corporation, but also supplement those products and services and help big organization innovate and do all of those things together. So that's a quick synopsis of findings. Now, we discovered 8 things that startups do with big companies, and we allocated them broadly into 2 big categories. On the left here, you see programs. These are kind of larger kind of collaborations between startups and big companies that require time, require resources. They take months to develop, and as a result, they are somewhat more difficult to do. On the right here, you see 4 activities. So activities can be very quick. They don't require big budgets. They can be organized on kind of a quick ad hoc basis. And so it's through this combination of bigger programs and smaller activities, we see that startups collaborate with big companies. And we will do a bit of a deep dive into programs and activities later on. What else did we find? So some numbers. So of course we have lots of statistics in the report. So what you see on the left here, you see overall engagement. This is basically out of 500 largest Forbes global companies, you see a percentage that are engaged in corporate venture capital. That's the first column. So you see that about 55% of the companies are engaged in corporate venture capital, which means 274 companies are engaged in corporate venture capital. You see this number on top. And you can see that accelerators and incubators looks like by far the most engaging practice. More companies are engaged in accelerators and incubators than anything else. Then there is corporate venture capital, business services. You see accelerators, incubators there, venture buildings. Building is kind of an emerging practice, venture clienting, and workspaces and events you can see there. And again, programs are on the left and activities are on the right. A bit more data. So you expect to see that companies in certain industries are more engaged with startups than in others. And indeed, this is what we find. This particular graph is for corporate venturing. So corporate venturing is also an interesting emerging practice, which we see more and more evidence of. So this is a practice whereby a company basically sponsors a startup, creates a startup, typically from internal people who used to work for a big company, but for example, having trouble launching an innovative activity within a company. So overall, what you see here is in total with programs and activities, you see technology sector is by far the most engaged. Programs you see engagement again at the level at the bottom. You see more than 80% of companies are engaged in programs. Activities a little bit less, and then you go from down in technology, you go all the way up to transportation sector, and transportation sector seems to be the least engaged into programs and activities, which is probably something that you would expect. Corporate objectives. So we looked at corporate objectives. Why do big companies engage with startups? We identified 6 big objectives. Anything from risk management and market expansion and access to new technology. But then newer ones are development of business ecosystems, social environmental impact, which is again kind of a new objective that we discovered. and then in developing entrepreneurial culture and capabilities, which is again probably something that you expect. What we also did, we linked this 8 corporate venturing practices with corporate objectives. And you see in this kind of a slightly busy diagram, you see that you achieve these corporate objectives on the right using those corporate venture practices on the left. And you see that some of the corporate venturing practices lead to achievement on many objectives on the right. So it's really, you have to pick the right combination. You have to think through what is it that you are trying to achieve on the right, and using these corporate objectives, then go back to the left and say, okay, let me pick corporate venturing practices, some kind of a combination, some kind of a basket of those practices that will allow me to achieve those corporate objectives, right? So for example, you see on the right, risk management. You want to manage risk for your company, risk and innovation activities. You might want to achieve that through corporate venture capital. You might go for an accelerator or incubator, maybe venture clienting, or maybe you want to build a venture from inside of your company. So these are the tools that you can use for managing your risks. Finally, I think the big picture, the big message that our report brings is that we see that this kind of a relationship between David and Goliath, very often this relationship is kind of more of a fighting, more of a competing for attention, not really talking to each other all that much. We see that it's being reimagined. We see that increasingly big corporations and startups become indispensable allies. So they work together, they work on common objectives, they learn new ways of working together. And as a result, there is less and less animosity between them, and more of a creating a common ecosystem that allows everyone to prosper, allows everyone to move forward with innovation. You've probably seen the link to the report. I want to bring it up here again. If you want to download full report, you can go to website, scan QR code. We are in early stage of release of this report, so we would welcome any feedback, any examples you might have, any case studies. If you're thinking maybe we missed something, or maybe you think about some interesting examples that we should have somewhere, this is a live report. Please drop us an email. Would love to learn from you, would love to learn from the trenches, and keep updating our report. And any and all feedback is welcome. And please, just to add to Jax's message early on, please ask your questions. We would love to have some questions today in the webinar.
One of the first things I want to get to talk a little more about is the why. And Sergei, you mentioned that some of the objectives that the report found were the things we expected. The report doesn't go as deep into it, but financial goals, innovation, but there are also new things that we weren't expecting. Can you tell us a little more about sort of the specific objectives and how this is something that isn't the standard competition and animosity that we used to picture that gave us the David and Goliath image? How is this new and different?
Yeah, so I actually had an earlier report some 12 years ago. I had a report on corporate startup collaboration. And at the time, we saw that the relationship between big companies and startups was, at best, would be defined as careful. They did not hire the same people. Startup founders, entrepreneurs, they would never go and work for a big company. They would not go to the same conferences. They would not think the same way. Startups were hungry for money, for clients. Big companies had all of that. On the other hand, big companies did not necessarily have the right talent to create innovative products and services, didn't have time or culture to experiment, and startups had all of that. So at the time, it already seemed like this should be a kind of a natural way for collaboration. But it's very often very hard to strike this conversation because big companies require immediate return on invested capital. They report to shareholders very often, and they are really careful about risk management. Oh, this product or service that startup offers, can I really use something like that? Will that expose data of my clients to somebody that I don't want to expose it to? So there are all these issues, right? But then over 10 years, I think this gap is closing. There is more and more realization that you can make startups a part of your innovation efforts. You can do internal R&D, which most companies do, but then you can supplement it with things that startups can do for you outside of your big organization.
So we have motivations there that are innovation related, and you also talked about in the summary about DEI and ESG, some of these things that are not so directly to the innovation and the bottom line. Claudio, you have some examples of stories of how these specific objectives that the report found. Can you tell us some of those specific stories about these objectives you found in firms that are achieving them?
Yes, absolutely. And hi, Jax. Hi. So many examples. For example, a big bank that want to stimulate like underrepresented founders, to be successful. Even because when they are approaching organizational startups to collaborate, they don't find a lot of diversity when they look to the founder's background. That's one example. Or for example, a big tech company, for example, Amazon, that are investing in huge, data centers that want to invest in technologies to carbon capture. So they would not develop themselves, but they can partner with startups to bring them together. So I mean, there are many examples that show, for example, this D&I that we found a lot of them, or ecosystems, for example, business ecosystem that not necessarily developing a company to help you absorb a company or technology to your organization, but just to stimulate this company to fill a gap in the business ecosystem where you play. For example, Visa, the credit card company, they do that very well. They have partnerships with fintechs that they know that can attach to their model, to their ecosystem and operate, and that it will become future big clients for them. For example, fulfilling like specific gaps that they see in the financial environment, in the financial industry. So these are kind of examples that we saw. There are many of them that are not necessarily related to the innovation of the core of the company. For example, we see a lot of companies, industrial companies, manufacturing companies that need some specific new technology like IoT or sensoring, whatever, inside their companies. Instead of trying to develop themselves some of these gaps that they find, they create like a partnership with startups to try to develop problems that they face in production, productivity, things like this. So what we see, and we somehow agreed, is that more than just focusing on the startups and the business side of what the startups can bring to your organization, these corporate venturing tools are becoming more like management tools that that you can use to kind of like solve management issues or management opportunities that you find in your way in your organization. And so you have several of them in different areas of the organization when they try to bring an innovative, a different way to solve a specific management problem, let's say this way. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, what you're saying sounds like the natural development of open innovation, of being able to go beyond your own walls, but specific to corporate and startup relationships, which is it's maybe the growth of open innovation is part of that evolution that you've seen, Serguei. So we have, along with this set of whys, we have different waves, different processes. You refer to them as kind of the bigger collaborations and the smaller activities. So the report refers to the bigger collaborations as a set of programs. And there's a number of different types of programs. You mentioned corporate venture capital, accelerators and incubators, venture building, and venture clienting. Some of these are things we've heard of before. CVC, accelerators, and incubators. These are familiar terms. what more can you tell us about these programs, about how they're being used, and the new ones versus the old? Sergei, can you give us a little more
Yes.
detail on that?
So I think when we think about corporate venturing, immediate reaction is to think about corporate venture capital, because that existed for a very long time, and most big companies have a corporate venture capital setup. Corporate venture capital is fine. This is a great way to innovate for a big company, invest in startups, but it's very expensive. So usually you need at least $100 million, maybe $200 million to set up a good venture capital fund. It takes a long time, right? So deploy those funds and so on. So takes a decade usually for a corporate venture capital fund. So if you're a big company, you can afford it. This is fantastic. It's not necessarily obvious that corporate venture capital will help you infuse your company with innovation, because very often these corporate venture capital units become very separate from the major company. And so there is really no spillover of knowledge, spillover of mentorship from a big company to startups, for example. And so this is where other programs come in. So if you think about accelerators and incubators, they've also been around for a while, but they're much cheaper. So setting up an accelerator, incubators, they usually have fixed term, 6 months, 3 months, maybe up to a year. You don't necessarily need $100 million. This is more about setting up a structure for maybe a few $1,000,000. You can use employees from the corporation to mentor, teach founders as a part of this accelerator and incubator, and you can better connect startups to businesses. So that's still a program, but much smaller in size, much more compact, much cheaper to set up. As I mentioned earlier, venture building emerged as one of the newer practices that we see, and venture clienting as well. So venture building is a situation where a company sometimes finds itself in a situation where there is no startup out there that does what the company wants, for example. And sometimes it could be because the big company, has an IP or know-how which needs to be commercialized. And really, the only way to do it is to take an internal employee, someone who maybe was director of this lab or scientist, and give this person money, give some resources, and say, look, you are on your own. You are a startup founder. You have incentive to grow this company because you have a stake in it, but you don't necessarily need to worry about fundraising because we're going to give you money. And you don't need to worry about having a customer because we can be your customer. We really understand that we need this, right? But then the startup does not have to have like exclusive rights of selling only to one company. So it's still a separate startup. So that's venture building, and we are seeing more and more of this in various industries. Interestingly, as our report indicates, venture building, I think, is very big in industries where you don't expect it to be. You don't expect a lot of innovation, like transportation, construction, and I think that's the reason why venture building is so big there is because it's hard to find startups in those industries. So big companies actually started building ventures themselves. And then the final program is venture clienting. So venture clienting, as I alluded to already, is giving startups access to companies' clients, for example, companies' customers, and test out solutions that innovative startups offer using clients of big companies as kind of a test bed. And this is an interesting approach. Again, we see it emerged over the last few years. And what's great about it, a big company can say, look, we are offering this solution. It's innovative. It's not ours. So if something goes wrong, risks are minimal. The big company can say, okay, you know what? We are stopping this. It's not working, right? Or if it's working, then you can grow and you can become a bigger and bigger client. And eventually maybe you want to acquire this company or acquihire this company and make it a part of your offering, right?
So I do want to ask a question on within that. You mentioned one of the program groups is accelerators and incubators. do we have a sense of how, and your chart showed that was one of the biggest as far as how many firms were doing this. Are they all creating their own accelerators and incubators, or are they participating, partnering with Techstars and other companies that are, I mean, I guess part of this is how expensive is that for them? Is it the creating your own? Is it also partnering with existing structures? Are there kind of multiple forms of that?
There's definitely multiple forms, right? So you don't have to create your own. You can partner with somebody else. Yeah, you're right. Y Combinators or Techstars. In the report, though, I believe we counted just the companies that had their own accelerators and incubators. That was kind of our yeah. That's the numbers that we report.
So that number kind of in practice in kind of varying degrees of commitment and effort is probably even bigger in that
than absolutely.
Yeah,
it could be much bigger. Again, this is something we only see something that companies say. So there could be all kinds of informal relationships that they don't necessarily publicize on their website.
So Claudio, what are some of the examples of how these old and new programs are being used in some of these firms? Who's got a really cool CVC or accelerator program? Who's doing venture climbing?
Yeah, so I mean, CVC, you see a lot of companies doing. I mean, you see the percentage there is one of the most adopted practices or programs. You can find a lot of examples. What we've seen is, as Serguei said very well, is that CVC has a dynamic that sometimes is difficult to integrate with the organization. There are integrations, there are cases of integrations. Recently, I talked to a big insurance company, global insurance company, where the CVC runs separately, but there are a lot of synergy sometimes when they see a solution that fits a strategic, situation in the organization, problem, opportunity, and they can bring together, and that can become like a client relationship, whatever. But what they told me is sometimes you have a very good solution, you're not the sole investor. There are other investors, and at the end, the best exit for the organization is to sell, and you lose everything because it goes to a competitor, and you cannot sometimes keep the patent or the IP, so on and so forth. So there are some limitations. And what is most interesting is seeing companies kind of complementing that drastically with, for example, venture clienting. If you go to the Bosch, Bosch, the German manufacturing company, they have a page dedicated to venture clienting. They tell the startups, come here to be a client of us, a strategic client. It's a procurement process, very well organized. They have problems, opportunities that they want to are strategically important for them, for their future. They have a whole process, very well organized, very successful. If you go to Siemens, the same. If you go to, there are many companies, that you go there and venture client start to become a very important thing for all the reasons that Serguei said. You don't have the same financial commitment. You can test. You can help the organization, the startups, to get exposure to a big corporation and learn from that. So there are a lot of advantages for both sides. So venture building as well. There are many cases. Serguei mentioned very well that usually organizations that have challenges that are difficult to find startups to supply some need, for example, aviation. So we saw examples of Boeing developing venture building to develop specific technologies that will be important for them in the future. Pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals identifying researchers that have an entrepreneurial mindset and help them develop the future drugs of the future in more like an incubator than the traditional research and development, creating startups. So for example, Takeda Pharmaceutical, they did a program like this, for example, because these spaces in the case of venture building are very, very expensive, and it's difficult again to go to startups and find them unless you have scientists or people that have proven before and found investors to back them. So you mentioned accelerator incubators. There are many of them, many out there. We see that there are different ways that organizations, and we are trying to distinguish that in a second phase of the research. For example, many organizations invest in accelerators to learn, to bring companies together to solve problems that nobody has an answer yet, and try to accelerate possibilities, incubators as well. But you have some organizations that create incubators, for example, for solutions they already know will be a foundational shift for their industry in the future, and they need to incubate that. So we are talking about a more robust kind of incubation that requires a lot of like attention and investment for the future. So you see some variation of the things for different reasons. Some of them are for learning accelerators, for example, is to accelerate technologies that are important for them. Could be like temporary advantage that they are seeing in a dynamic market, could be more foundational, advantage that can build like something competitive advantage, some competitive advantage in the future. So there are many different ways that they use these instruments for different strategic needs.
And it's interesting to hear when we think about it, sort of the ways we used to do things, the older methods of corporate venture capital, accelerator and incubator, that was the big firms participating in the existing ecosystem, in the existing entrepreneurship, whereas venture building, which almost sounds like sponsored spinouts, and venture clienting, which is really sort of pulling in and these corporations initiating these relationships versus waiting for the entrepreneurs to be far enough along to come and talk to them. It does seem to be an evolution of these Goliaths realizing we can be more involved, we can gain more from these relationships, and these positive relationships and embracing startups is really a much more fruitful outcome for us for all of our objectives.
Absolutely. And just a point about CVC, because we think about CVC as a very expensive way to learn a new thing. So because you invest in money, you need to capture, you need to have a team. But in some cases, for example, the first example that Serguei used today, the relationship between OpenAI and Microsoft. Some cases you don't have an option. You need to try to understand an industry that is emerging. It's very high tech, don't find a lot of talent, you don't find a lot of companies. CVC is the only option to learn something new that has a big chance to disrupt your industry or bring a new foundational shift, let's say this way, to your industry. So it depends. That's why we saw this noodle graphic, that is so mixed, because it depends on one side, what is the objective you're looking for and how do you learn or explore this objective, in ways that are feasible for you. And you have all these activities. Yes.
So that actually brings us to my next question rather well. CVC can be a 10-year investment. CVC is that long-term story. And the report also looked at a bunch of activities, and I think, Serguei, you described them as the quick interactions, the ones that could be short. They might be part of the bigger programs, but these are things that can be smaller interactions, can be one-off without a program. Tell us more about some of these activities and how those are helping the Goliaths get more out of the Davids.
Certainly.
I'm loving this metaphor. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's a great thing about activities is that they're cheap and rather quick. So if you want to kind of get your toes in this water of innovation and try a few things out, it's very easy. Events are probably the simplest one. So you can run a hackathon and you can say, hey, I have this specific problem that I'm trying to solve. Any startup that is working in this space, come participate, win a prize, maybe $100,000. This all started probably with this famous Netflix prize where Netflix gave out $1 million, which seems like a lot of money, but compared to CVC, that's just a pennies, right?
Yep.
And famously, CEO of Netflix later on said, hey, we calculated how many hours people with PhDs spend solving our problem of recommending movies, and we figured we paid about $10 per hour, 10 cents per hour, I'm sorry. So that's not bad for someone, with a PhD working to solve your problem. So events are the first one. Shared workspaces is another very simple one. Find the floor of your building which you are not using, give people internet, maybe have a receptionist, and that's a very, very low running cost of the buildings that you are owning anyways, probably. And invite startups which are roughly in your space to come and sit there, and then ask your managers to look over their shoulders and say, hey, what are you working on? What is this technology? How are you thinking about this? What should I be thinking about in my business? And at the same time, you get startups to talk to businesses and understand their needs and how they think about solving everyday problems. mentorship is another attractive way to work with startups. So startups are constantly looking for mentors. They might have a great solution. They have no idea how to sell it to a corporate manager. They don't necessarily know KPIs that manager has and all kinds of things that you need to sign and be aware of to be able to offer a solution that company would buy. So creating kind of a pool of mentors who can share their knowledge and guide startups and connect with startup founders to exchange knowledge, that's relatively cheap and probably costs tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And final one is, of course, business services. So a lot of companies nowadays start engaging with startups by offering them services, sometimes for free. So you can go to Amazon, you can go to Microsoft, you can get free cloud compute, space tokens, whatever that you want, and that's the way to engage you. And then Microsoft will offer, for example, a lot of their Office, Microsoft Office and other tools for free to startups for first 3 years. And that way, when the company hopefully is growing and becoming bigger and able to pay, they are already sitting on the cloud. They're already engaged in solutions that the big company offers. So all of those things don't really cost a lot, can be deployed basically within a month, and you can see results within a few weeks.
In my research, so much of what I'm looking at is how entrepreneurs are trying to get resources and trying to find ways to get resources with less commitment. So many of these activities are inexpensive for the corporations to provide resources that the entrepreneurs are desperate need of. And the trade-off, I'm not giving up equity, I'm not making commitments, it has no negative impacts on my future acquisition or exit stories. They're great ways for these firms to gain resources. Now, Serguei, you mentioned hackathons and like cloud computing and resources and things like that. Claudio, what are some of the other examples, maybe ones we wouldn't have heard of these activities that corporations are doing with entrepreneurial firms?
Yeah, many. I mean, for example, events, pitch competitions, they are very common as well. We said innovation days, that could be a very common way as well. If you go to business services, we saw so many different ones. For example, an Indian bank that created solutions, banking solutions only for startups, knowing their reality and allowing them to, do not have the burden of, in an emerging country like in India, sometimes have a bank account and all the costs related to that, and the bureaucracy is expensive, it's time, and they develop something to allow them to thrive faster. And all think about, okay, it's cheap right now, but that can become a big client for me later. So there's a big bank in West, for example, we're not authorized to share the company, but the case, yes, that they started actually interactions with startups through business services, helping startups with good ideas and good business cases to get closer to the wealth management clients, kind of getting them together. And at the end, what they saw was this kind of service would allow them to track, scout potential startups that could be useful for them in the organization. And it resulted in some acquisitions by this big organization, this financial institution, of some of them, So what else I can tell about that? I mean, workspace, we see that a lot in many spaces. For example, we see sometimes that fashion companies like Vinci, they create like co-working hub spaces, because you need, in these industries like fashion industry, it's a very dynamic industry. Trends change quickly. You have not only the seasons, now with like social media, it becomes very dynamic. So sometimes creating co-working spaces like this, you can easily stay connected with people that are creating the new trends and having new ideas. So you kind of feed your organization with a culture that sometimes is difficult to create by yourself, for example. So we see a lot of banks in emerging countries, for example, Brazil, my country, you see big banks like Bradesco or Itaú that they have this big working space environments that is a mix of working space with incubators, without like the looking necessary to strategic fit, but to allow hundreds of startups stay close to them and eventually have a strategic fit for them. They have different names, sometimes operate separately from the organization, but they stay connected somehow to that. So there are hundreds of examples. I think Serguei mentioned very well These are easy ways to stay connected, to scout, to develop some relationships without creating like strong bonds necessary at this moment. That could be in a second step when you go to the programs.
So what you're saying actually connects really well with one of the questions we have in the chat. And please, attendees, please, if you have questions, enter them in the chat, because I want to use those last 15 minutes to kind of to get some of your questions. There's a question about how do the corporations and the entrepreneurial firms balance the IP issues in some of these structures? Is it about, is it related to which ones they're choosing? Are there some norms for how we manage our IP issues? And I imagine that's actually one of the things that is the scary part of working with Goliath when you're David. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Claudio, you want to take this one?
I can start, maybe you can help me. But, of course, these organizations, these corporations, they are very serious. Most of them, they have, their legal area are huge, and they try to protect both sides. Most of the times we see that this is a honest relationship. That's one point. But another thing that I think we need to start paying attention is how do we reframe ownership? There are some industries that are so dynamic that what do you want to have, ownership, or do you want to be faster than the other competitors, for example? So does it make sense to have too many constraints in the ownership that could avoid like a potential partnership to thrive? Or instead of that, you should just have like basic constraints, and allow that to be more free and evolve faster. That's something that we are seeing right now. So we see some organizations that clearly say that, hey, ownership, IP is not important for me. You can keep it, I can pay for you, or we don't even care about that. We just need the pace. We need to get that, prove that that's something that is useful, go quick to market, and sell that. And when we see competitors moving, we are already like far ahead of them, and we can have other things as well. So that's something that we are seeing, that ownership itself, in some industries, maybe we need to reframe how we perceive how to control that. Serguei, maybe you have other things to say.
Yeah, I think there is always trade-off between, as Claudio said, ownership and speed. There is also trade-off between ownership and cost, right? So big corporations have their own structures. They pay billions in R&D. So sure, you can own all of your IP and spend billions hiring people, very expensive people with pension plans and retention packages and this and that, right? And what I've heard repeatedly from many corporate managers is they say, look, I just cannot even afford to hire people who would be working for OpenAI on a product, right? That's not a salary that is in my salary grid. They just don't fit in, right? And so sure, you might want to own IP, but then you're gonna pay a lot for it. Versus with a startup, you have scrappy founders who would otherwise be paid a lot, but they're working for equity in this company. They move quick. They are going to be willing to probably run free pilots with the company and keep testing out services. And they have monetization some years ahead in their mind, but this would allow you to move quickly and spend very little. So you have to ask yourself this question, what is worth more to me, and at the end of the day, even if you have money, you might not be able to attract the right people ever, right? Because a lot of people just don't want to work. A lot of innovative people just don't want to work for a big corporation developing, within the boundaries of this large organization with bureaucracy, right? So there are definitely trade-offs.
Is it a challenge for the corporations to kind of manage the IP fears of startups, or are startups more and more comfortable with all these structures, and this is how it works, and this is how our IP is gonna? Are Davids not looking at them as Goliaths anymore? Are they not looking at them as something to be afraid of? Is that changing? That might be beyond the realm of this.
I think it's definitely changing. I think we have to we have to think a little bit about specific industries. So, if you think about pharma, for example, IP is very strong. So your hope is to have a patent for a drug and, then probably milk this patent for a couple of decades or something like that. Now, think about, on the other hand, about a retail company, right? So what kind of IP are we talking about? Is it going to be some rocket engines that, we're going to develop with a startup? Probably not. It's probably going to be more of a business model innovation rather than technological innovation. And business models are almost impossible to patent to begin with.
Yes.
So, it's very hard to protect them. So at this point, I don't think there's going to be a big concern that, hey, we have to have something very hush-hush exclusive and, patented. That just is not the kind of innovation that many companies are looking for.
Yeah. No, and just a comment on that. I mean, I remember a few years ago when I was like in executive roles, how challenging was to develop contracts and boundaries in partnerships. Let's call it this way. So, but if you see, like business ecosystems have evolved very fast. Today it's even automatic. I mean, you are part of a business ecosystem. You have all the contracts, everything in a platform that you go there and sign and you adjust. So I think the organizations are kind of evolving, to accommodate this reality. They are accommodating different kind of contracts, relationships. How do we protect you, and how I get protected as well? I think the whole field is evolving together. That would be my reaction based on my experience when we see companies moving to accommodate these new kind of relationships.
So we have a question, which is I knew we were going to get, because everything is AI these days. Where are corporations using these AI workflows and these opportunities to kind of orchestrate through agents rather than people to support some of these relationships? Or are we seeing AI as a tool for these programs, or are we just seeing the Davids are all AI firms? Like where is the AI playing in this?
Tough question, because this is so new, and I would actually maybe I'll post a link in our chat room. So I am hosting a second season of Where AI Works podcast for Wharton, and this is where we're kind of discussing where AI works and how companies monetize it. And I interviewed chief technology officer from Analog Devices, and I interviewed a startup founder from ADOC, which is a very big startup. I interviewed executive from Microsoft, and I have a next one from Johnson & Johnson. And all of them are saying that, look, it's very nascent. It's, we are trying things. We are attempting at various AI tools. They try agents, they try different platforms. Nobody has the answer yet how this will work. It's all evolving as we speak, I would say.
And every one of those companies you just mentioned are also companies that are doing accelerators and incubators that have these CVC programs that are using all of this at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All of them are very engaged with startups. And, as I was interviewing AI doc CEOs, they are engaged with some of the big tech companies. And so it's evolving very, very quickly. Nobody has answers yet. You can talk about some business models that companies are trying, and I can give kind of my view on this AI tools. So I invested in several AI startups. What I'm seeing is that when AI is solving a problem which has easily measurable KPIs, for example, you are talking to your customer, say customer support, it's very easy. AI takes over. You see that customer weight is decreasing, satisfaction is increasing, number of tickets which are unresolved is smaller, very measurable. That's when you can easily monetize it, start charging money for it, because you can see a clear result. Now, if, like this question alludes to, you automate internal workflows, it's much harder. So, you say, okay, I'm going to make your people more efficient. Well, for many white collar tasks, it's very hard to measure efficiency, especially if it's something creative, something, code writing, maybe you can measure it. But, imagine it's some creative industry or, something that you don't track on a daily basis, then it's very, very hard to prove that you are delivering value with AI agent. You can say, hey, I improved your productivity. You're like, okay, how? Show me what are the numbers? And if you go to employees and ask them, hey, did this AI agent make you more productive, so we need less of you? People will say, hell no, it's me. I'm just working harder, better, So that's what I'm seeing. But that's more anecdotal.
But it sounds like this is more something that they're going to be bringing in startups to try these things out within these programs, and then
Absolutely,
as we all figure out how AI changes our worlds.
yes, this is where venture clienting comes in. Yeah,
absolutely. So another question, I think this is definitely thinking about how do corporations approach this? How do you do this if you aren't doing it yet? How should companies think about starting these programs, or what measures, whether I should start a CVC program, whether I should start an incubator, how to get into these activities, these programs? I guess this is sort of that, what is your advice for companies thinking about entering these programs and activities, starting these processes? How do we think about which ones to do and when? Whoever wants to.
Yeah, so I think the answer is, to me, is if you have enough money, do all of them now. If you have enough money, bandwidths, it's great to have a full portfolio. And you know what? The most innovative companies out there, Microsofts and Googles and Amazons, they have all of these programs, like all of them, and multiple, right? Which is why they are innovative companies, because they used to be startups themselves 20 15 30 years ago. But the most important thing, I think, is to be clear with your goals, because if your goal is to make your managers more innovative, for example, and create a culture of innovation, and you say, oh, let me create a corporate venture capital fund, that is not going to make your managers more innovative. That has nothing to do with your managers. Corporate venture capital fund will run separately and invest in startups, and your managers will probably never see those startups and learn about them. So you have to be very goal oriented, very specific. Here's what I need to do. And then look at our noodle diagram and think a little bit and say, hey, here is a practice that can help me get there. And probably it's not one practice, it's probably 2 or 3 practices used as a portfolio.
Yeah. No, I would complement that. I mean, just saying that, today it's very difficult to organizations to articulate their strategy, because strategy has become more flow than necessarily like a point to get, So what I would say is, okay, even if you don't have clarity, you have a good understanding of your context, how dynamic is your context, what are the technology that will impact in the future, how, that will impact the skills you need in your organization. So you have a lot of questions, and you could organize these questions in ways that you can explore outside of your organization. I think to stay inside of your organization is stupid when you see so many things happen at the same time. So why don't think about that? There is 2 big components here. We at least we discussed it a little bit. That there's one is how we learn about what's going on, and there are many activities are a very good way to do that. If you have more money, you can have big incubators or accelerators that can bring these companies close to you, for example. But there's the other side as well, that is once you know that there are some solutions or some possibilities that are more real that you need to exploit more as well, that's the moment that programs can help you as well. So which are the areas that you want to go further? You are for sure that there will be, or at least you have more certainty, it's more probable that these things will impact your organization. How do you don't set up like structures that will give you an edge, in these things that can represent competitive advantage for you in the future. So I think it's not difficult. If you don't have clarity of your strategy, you can set up things that can feed your organization to explore and to exploit using startups as well. The problem is technology is not going to stop. It's evolving very fast. Business models are evolving very fast. We talk about like even legal areas, everything is evolving very fast. You as an organization to attend the needs of your clients, it's difficult to do everything by yourself. Even EVs, we see Tesla that was a vertical model for a long time, but right now we see the horizontal models catching up very fast, because they developed everything, and now you have different parts of the ecosystem being developed by other people. And you see BMW, all others coming very quickly, to this space because they are partners. They cannot solve all the things by themselves. So I think it's not difficult to design something that could work for your organization in the context that you're operating. Yeah.
So my last question, because we're running out of time at this point, I know you guys are still continuing to work on these questions, these relationships and motivations and methods by which the corporations and startups are working. Where is the next place for your work, for this research? What are the things you're looking at next? What's the next webinar going to be about, the next report? Where are you focusing that stuff?
Yeah, great question. So we would love to make it a live report where we would love to hear from the field what is happening in companies, what rationales they use, because there is, again, our report is based on what companies state, but we would love to do some deep dives on some of those arrangements. And we actually have a couple of research projects going on with a couple of companies where we are studying not only how companies engage with startups, but also what is the outcome. And outcomes are really hard because, outcomes for all these accelerators, incubators, they're buried within corporate financials. So it's impossible to separate them out. So unless the company tells us and say, hey, here is how it worked for us, here is what worked, here is what didn't, we cannot do much more than just looking at what companies state. So our hope is that we will be able to drill down to saying, hey, here is what works better in certain situations, and here is what doesn't work as well.
Sounds good. We are running out of time. We are out of time. I want to thank Claudio and Serguei. Thank you so much for telling us more about this report. I'm going to actually leave on an open call to those attendees who are here with us today or watching us recorded on YouTube. If your firm is doing things about this stuff, please, put it in the comments, reach out to Mack, tell us about what you're doing. And perhaps you'll be hearing from us and be part of the future stages of this research as we try to look at more about what is happening in these relationships and as we go forward. I want to thank you all attendees for joining us. Again, Claudio and Serguei, this is really, really great work, really interesting stuff to learn. Thank you so much for telling us all about it.